Welcome everybody to today's Humanities Research Fellowship seminar. We're very, very happy to welcome Leila with us today, who's going to give a presentation on her project entitled Sound and Political Authority in Post-Gaddafi Libya. I also wanted to make sure to properly introduce our dear colleague and friend Deborah Caption, who has graciously agreed to moderate today's session. Deborah is a professor of performance studies at New York University, and her research areas include North Africa, sound, narrative, translation theory, genre theory, ethnography, phenomenology, and poetics. And I need to mention that just 2 weeks ago, a new book by Deborah has come out called Poetic Justice, an Anthology of Contemporary Moroccan Poetry. I'll put it in the chat. It's a wonderful volume. It has received a lot of praise, so please make sure to check it out. So with that, thanks so much for joining us today, and please enjoy the presentation, and over to you, Deborah.
Thank you, Martin. And I am absolutely thrilled to have Leila Tayeb with us today. Leila and I met more than a decade ago in New York when Leila was studying at performance studies in New York City. She went on to do her dissertation and her doctoral work at Northwestern. So in fact, she is such an intense performance studies person because she has degrees from both of the two major performance studies departments in the United States. I also followed her as she was doing her fascinating ethnography. I followed her as much as social media allowed in Libya, and she's done really extensive work. So her work personally interests me a great deal, of being on sound and performance. But she's, after she finished her doctoral work, she went to Cornell, where she was a postdoctoral fellow, and now here with us, and I couldn't be happier. So Leila's finishing the touches on her book called Producing Authority in Post-Gaddafi Libya, Sound, Space, and Performativity. And I think we're going to hear an aspect of that research today. So welcome, and it's yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Deborah. Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you to Martin. Thank you to Raya and to Alex for organizing this event. And thank you to the tech folks making sure that things go smoothly, and to a student named Rania who made today's event poster. Let me go ahead and share my screen, which has that event poster. Okay, that's okay for everyone. I hope you can see what I'm hoping you can see. All right, so what I want to do today is sketch something between a kernel and a broad overview of my book manuscript in progress. And I should say that finishing touches would be premature. This is very, very much still in the process of being written. And so doing this kernel and broad overview will mean that I will paint with some fairly broad strokes and toggle in and out between the scope of the wide claim and that of the ethnographic particular. I will present snippets actually of material from 3 different chapters in an effort both to give you a sense of the textures of the project sites, as in places in this case, and sounds, as well as to present the book's overarching aims. I'm gonna move my text, see if this works a little better. Okay, I want to start by grounding us in the realm of daily life with about 1 minute of music. This mobile phone video is from the summer of 2016, a Thursday evening concert in Tripoli. The locale is a venue that in my writing I call the beach, and it's a setup familiar to Abu Dhabi beachgoers. You pay an entry fee and get access to shade, swimming, and snacks. While concerts at this point in urban Libya are mostly few and far between, tonight's casual event is part of a series, and I am part of an audience enthusiastic about the chance to sit outside with friends and hear live music. I think we can probably all now well imagine the welcome relief of this after months of long hours spent at home.
فاحنا بنغنوا له اغنيه تو، لكن في سطر بسيط عودوه معي لو سمحتوا. كان فيها كيف؟ نبي نتجوز، نبي بنت الأحلام، بوها يكون راجل طيب، خوها عوال ومش تنبال، أمها تعرف الطيب، تطيب متاع زمان، يا ناس نبي نتزوج، خلاص راني تعبان. لسان برين تبع كلها. وما نبيش اصحابي يشوفوها، ما نبيش اصحابي يشوفوها، ما نبيش اصحابي يشوفوها، ما نبيش اصحابي يشوفوها. ما هو اصحابي معكوكي، ما هو اصحابي معكوكي.
The argument that I make about these concerts in an article published earlier this year and as part of the larger project is that they were sites for the production of militia power. In the instance of this beach venue, a militia base sat just across the road, and one arriving to the beach would generally encounter members of this militia orchestrating the movement of cars through a major intersection nearby, perhaps stopping you, perhaps waving you through. This beach area allowed entry only for families, meaning groups of male youth could not make this recreation area their destination. Beach management made an exception for the young men making up this militia's ranks. They would move freely and conspicuously about the compound. Accompanying the musicians, I had access during that summer to a private building with its nicer bathroom. There, I often awkwardly bumped into militia members who also enjoyed privileged access and would come across the street to shower. It was known then that this beach compound lay under the control of the neighboring militia. And indeed, this was part of its appeal as a destination for recreation. Being uncontested made it relatively safe. What I try to lay out are the mechanics of this temporary and contingent territorial projection, which took place in part through sound. Concert nights didn't often include large groups of militia members. The most I ever saw were 2 or 3 people at a time, standing off to the side of the audience near the beach entrance and watching briefly. You can kind of see where that blue light in the back is. If members of the militia did this at all, the group's leader would be among them, and often it would just be him alone or accompanied by the beach compound's manager. And as was representative in the minute of concert we watched, the music and sociality around which these events revolved sometimes pushed at social norms playfully, but they just as often didn't, and they did not ever directly vocalize partisanship in the ongoing local or national conflicts of the moment. Nonetheless, participation in these concerts as musicians and as listeners enabled the production of grounded and specific militia power. Before and after 2011, concerts in Libya have frequently been shut down, sometimes beforehand and sometimes midway through. Prior to the revolution, it was generally agents of Gaddafi's government who stopped performances. Since 2011, a wide variety of individuals and groups have taken it upon themselves to decide when musical events should not run as planned. The quintessential question for concert planners has become, how can we avoid the event's interruption and the participants' arrest? In this context, the concerts convened at the beach became performative acts of militia power. By permitting concerts and allowing them to run without interruption, the militia performed its authority over the event at the beach and its occupants, producing sociopolitical space. This was their territory, and in it operated their rules. The performers might not, and most often did not, choose political affiliation with the militia, but their musical acts nonetheless helped to consolidate the militia's territorial authority. Everyone in attendance was implicated. Listening together, audiences were interpolated in concert into relation with militia authority, forming a temporary public that ratified that authority through its very presence. Let me now double back to speak briefly about who and what I mean when I use the term militia. At a basic level, I'm drawing directly from my fieldwork. Libyans use the term militia, militiate, and for an individual member, militiawi. In the book, I spend some time tracing the discursive and economic shift wherein we moved from describing armed groups as revolutionaries, often linked to a town, as in the Wars in 10, for example, to the inclusion of many more on post-2011 state payrolls, and in some cases, the overstaying of welcomes in places like city parks and other makeshift barracks, and the eventual predominance of the third-person descriptor, militias. In response, armed groups also reformed as power shifted and moved toward less temporary sounding names, now using words like forces and often special forces, so qawat or qawat khassa. In the case of the beachside militia base, this was generally understood to be a branch of a larger Tripoli militia with a well-known name. But at that time, the norm was to wear general military fatigues and drive in vehicles painted with the words police or interior ministry. Indeed, when I once asked that particular militia leader if I could take a photo of him, he declined by describing himself as mahroug, wanted, and or by virtue of being, he put it bluntly, the leader of a militia. In using the term militia, I'm also lingering around the word's fuzziness. What is a militia in relation to the state? Is it specifically not a military body? Is it adjacent to governmental power, or rather oppositional to it? In speaking of militia politics and militia power, I am almost entirely not interested in who a group is or what ideology is attributed to them. This is partly because these parts shift, of course, but it is also because I am instead concerned with showing how the categories of militia and civilian are constructed through their opposition in daily life. Most often when my civilian interlocutors recount experiences with militias, whether at concerts or checkpoints, they don't know who in particular they are encountering. I am interested in what that not knowing means and does. Let me zoom out further now from militia politics to national politics. There are a small number of researchers working on post-2011 Libya, and within that work, there's a prevailing rhetoric through which it is common to describe the country as fragmented, chaotic, having collapsed into civil war. In the book project, I trace these tropes backwards through earlier scholarship, and I find a surprising continuity. Even while these descriptors suggest a socio-political break stemming from the death of Gaddafi and the end of his 42-year rule, they track with consistency into a much longer-term scholarly fascination with the idea of Libya as a stateless society. The notion of stateless Libya is both related to, but not exclusively coterminous with the political theory of Gaddafi's Green Book and its famous neologism, al-Jamahiriyya, the political system resulting from direct popular rule, the state of the masses. Long before the Free Officers' coup of 1969, in which Gaddafi took power, and even several decades before the advent of post-colonial Libya in 1951, Western scholars and travel writers used the term stateless to describe Bedouin political organization. So one of my aims in this project is to historicize and ethnographically thicken assertions of statelessness, while I am also particularly concerned with the impact of the predominance of narrow definitions of the political in terms of producing norms within Libyan studies. If popular culture, art practice, and the realm of daily life all fall into ostensibly fluffy categories that are expected not to have bearing on the future of the country, then scholarship on Libya risks being as removed from the lived experiences of most Libyans as the official political process currently is. Turning to sound practices as a site of contestation enables me to approach the realm of politics and state-making with greater attunement to the structures of possibility and constraint that shape the lived experiences of my civilian interlocutors. It enables me to make two adjacent claims. The first is that across a range of sites and conditions during the years since 2011, militias in Libya's urban areas have used sound practices to produce their own political authority. This I've already given a brief example of. The second claim is that these sound practices have in turn formed dispersed sites of political contestation between militias and civilians, categories that are produced against each other, in part through the kinds of situations I consider. If I can offer a midpoint framing then of my talk today, one reason I have pulled out the threads of the project that I have is to outline the notion of sound practices as it animates this project. Sound takes a range of forms in my thinking and writing, moving between the material and the metaphorical, between vibration and meaning. The practice part of the term is equally important as it denotes the processual and the relational. In what I've presented so far, I have been concerned primarily with militia soundscapes, the way that militia-built sonic environments help to produce political authority. In the material I will turn to now, I am thinking about questions related to voice and listening. This work precedes what I've thus far discussed in the order of the book, and that is because it tries to articulate broader racial politics that both predate militia politics and are exacerbated by them. The town of Tawarga, which you see here, was destroyed in what was framed as an act of retribution in August 2011. And when I say destroyed, I mean the town was destroyed. All of the people were either driven out, killed, etc. Neighboring the port city of Misrata, Tawarga had been home to descendants of enslaved people, Black Libyans whose racialization was tied both to stigmatized slave descendants and to a constructed contrast with the valorized self-image of many Misratans as descendants of Turks. The proximity of Tawarga to Misrata follows a mapping familiar to many other contexts. After manumission, formerly enslaved people moved into wage labor, often working for their former enslavers. Barely more than 150 years span the difference between official manumission in 1856 and the 2011 uprising. And of course, as in many other contexts, official manumission is not any kind of a clear date marking the end of the practice. During 2011, and particularly in March of that year, protesters and revolutionaries in Misrata faced horrific attacks by regime forces. In the accounts of that violence, Tawargans were accused of having fought on the side of the regime and participated in rapes and killings. Earlier in the year, in his infamous February 2011 speech, a beleaguered Muammar Gaddafi had demanded of those revolting against his government, "Man antum, who are you?" There was something about this interpellation, its directness, the obvious fact that Gaddafi was not going to listen to any answers to it, that struck a chord that resonated throughout the popular cultural production that accompanied the uprising of that momentous year. In the speech, Gaddafi promptly provided his own answers. The protesters were rats given pills by agents of foreign governments to drive them to rise up. Many aspects of the text and imagery of this speech circulated in visual art and in music in and beyond Libya. In fact, audio samples of Gaddafi from that day have had an afterlife in electronic music that continues a decade later. The phrase itself, "Man antum," has become tied to the face of Gaddafi in his last year, and you see this text accompanying his face in all kinds of pop art, everything from street murals in 2011 inside Libya to t-shirts and mugs sold to hipsters in Amman. I'll just show a few of this genre that circulate online, moving from a screenshot of the video from the original speech to the kind of impending doom cartoon that dominated in 2011, to the outline face sort that you may have seen on mugs and t-shirts. And I'll stop here with this depiction of a tiny Muammar facing off against an uprising of stoic Omar Mukhtars. So this question, "Man antum," was met with forceful and plentiful replies. In popular music, I argue these responses abounded in iterations both direct and specific, and implied and broad. In a song titled "Wain Slah," "Where are the guns?", then anonymous artist Ibn Thabit rapped the refrain. He says, "Who are you? We're Libyans. We know who we are, but where do you come from?" This is the part where I very badly, very unpoetically translate rap lyrics. But here's the actual song.
قالك من أنتم إحنا الليبيين نعرفوا نحن شكون نبي أصلك أنت منين.
In a less famous but similarly audacious track, "Jack al-Hallaq ya Muammar, Muammar the barber has come for you," Gaddafi is sampled as if into a conversation.
من أنتم؟
أنت اللي من؟
يا معمر القذافي
لحسابك واحد مهم المهم تعالوا خلينا نحلقوك حندير لك كبسة زي ما درنا الخوك.
So when Gaddafi asks "Man antum," the rapper responds with something that sort of like, "Psh, who are you?" Christiane Gruber has written about the racial politics of visual caricatures of Gaddafi from 2011, and this latter song is part of the same lexicon, wherein revolutionary artists attack the dictator through anti-Black tropes, in particular around his curly hair, half of the meaning of the barber in this song. If finding these direct responses to Gaddafi's interpellation is easy enough, Less obvious iterations of this phenomenon may have been more impactful at the level of rhetoric and affect. It's hard to overstate the importance that Benghazi-based singer Salah Ghali's somber anthem for Misrata took on for participants and supporters of the uprising during 2011. Released in the aftermath of regime attacks, this song addresses the city, imploring her to stay steadfast as the singer promises to come to her aid.
مصراتة صبرك اني جاي ما شاء الله عليك مرجلة والنصر جاي جاي جد العزم يا مصراتة صبرك اني جاي ما شاء الله عليك مرجلة والنصر جاي جاي ينصرنا ربي من عنده بدنا ان شاء الله على الطاغي هو وعياله وجردنا اللي معاه.
At the end of that segment, Ghali sings a hope that God would enable the revolutionaries to prevail over the dictator, his sons, and the rats with him. Accusations of the use of foreign mercenaries as pro-government forces abounded during this period, conjuring prior Libyan involvement in Chad and elsewhere. In her article on visual culture, Gruber describes satirical portrayals of Gaddafi as, in her words, instrumentally racist. I agree with her, and yet in longer form, able to make a farther reaching argument that these assertions of opposition to Gaddafi reflected and reified a racial politics rooted in both earlier and recent Saharan history that rendered Black Libyans others to a Libyan formation of whiteness. Songs like those we've just heard hooked into these racial politics as they constructed a moral and political opposition wherein to be with Gaddafi was to be a rat and an African mercenary. Music lends itself to the presentation format, but much of the book chapter focuses on what Nina Aichem has termed the micropolitics of listening to vocal timbre. Aichem shows how the belief that sound is knowable and the assumption that what we hear corresponds to a fixed referent foster, she says, a specific kind of listening where the primary goal is to identify difference from that reference. When we listen to voices with this kind of listening, she says, we, quote, fail to attend to the many ways in which vocal timbre is learned and performed, including those we associate with race, ethnicity, or authenticity. The relative anonymity of militia members that I discussed a few minutes ago stands in contrast to a listener's contention that they can detect the foreignness of a fighter phenotypically or in the voice or accent when they report an encounter with a mercenary. There were actual mercenaries. So the quote is attempts to sort of talk about both of those things. By attending to the micropolitics of listening to vocal timbre, it becomes possible to parse processes of racialization as they shifted during and after 2011 through and alongside the continued realities of the cross-border movement of people and arms. The last area I'll move to briefly is concerned with audition as a privileged sensory field for civilians when navigating encounters at checkpoints, a shifting but regular feature of daily life during the past 10 years in and between urban areas in Libya. Actually, I'm going to pause myself and say that I very recently realized that this chapter also needs to include audition as a privileged sensory field for people who have been forcibly disappeared or kidnapped. So so we can talk about that in the questions and answers if anyone would like. Oh, there we go. During periods of intense contestation, militias operating checkpoints often obfuscated the identifying information of their members and even the militia grouping itself with nondescript uniforms or fatigues and facial coverings. These practices ostensibly protected those doing the work of security from targeted attack, but they also heightened the vulnerability of the unarmed residents who were to be protected by this structure. So of course, the picture I'm showing you in this slide is an exception to this practice insofar as the flag is relatively recognizable, right? We know it to be possibly related to the Islamic State, and in the Libyan case, it was expected to be related to the group Ansar al-Sharia. But even, so I of course don't have images from my own field work of checkpoints for fairly obvious reasons. It's not the safest place to try and take a photograph. And a photograph like this comes from the social media of this militia group. So it's relatively, so it's different in that sense from what I'm describing. But even here we have the militia members themselves wearing face masks. So approaching a traffic stop operated by a few men in balaclavas, a lone driver or a pair or a car full of people would look to visual cues first to try to ascertain who might be stopping them. Once stopped and once the visual information was depleted, civilians needed to listen attentively to both what was said to them and how, as well as to any comments passed between checkpoint operators. Civilians honed new listening capacities in the context of this increased vulnerability, and these capacities in turn led to novel tactics to contest the very structures that produced them. So in this way, the militia checkpoint becomes a site both for the production of militia power and for its contestation. The rhetorical and affective tactics that civilians cultivated in the fact of this daily reality often played with the same ambiguity between state and religious authority that created increased unpredictability in what might count as a legal transgression. My civilian interlocutors skillfully drew upon different aspects of the Islamic discursive tradition than their militia interrogators to counter accusations and threats. So let me give you an example of what I'm describing here, because I realize that's a bit up in the clouds. This story belongs to a Benghazi pop singer with a fair amount of fame. I'm going to read you my translation of his telling. He says, so I was stopped at a checkpoint here in Benghazi, just here, close to home, close to Dubai Street. I was on my way home at night around 1 a.m. It had gotten late because I had something to do. I don't remember what exactly. And there were 100 checkpoints on the way home, and Ansar al-Sharia and those guys with that black flag. So I stopped the car and the guy looked at me, your papers and all that. I had my papers with me and everything, so it was okay. The guy who was asking me for my papers was clearly a young man, you know. I didn't recognize his face, but he recognized me. So he said, aren't you Muhammad al-Shayish who sings? And he said it loudly. Of course, the other guys who were older than him heard. Do you sing? He asked as he looked at me. At this point in his story, Muhammad pauses for dramatic effect. His audience, a group of musicians and me seated in a downtown Benghazi cafe, is familiar with the kind of encounter he describes. Both the process of gathering information and the stakes of doing so are apparent in the details he conveys to us. The plethora of checkpoints belonging to the same or different armed groups, the visual cue of the black flag, the age of Muhammad's primary interlocutor and that of his companions, the volume of the militia member's question, the implication of his question, the corner that Muhammad seems to be backed into. Arriving now at the punchline of his story, Muhammad breaks into a wide smile. These are his words again. So I told him, yeah, I sing. I even sing Tala al-Badru alayna. They cracked up. I was laughing. I took the situation easy, you know. It was a dangerous situation, but I took it easy. Now, listening, you're either lost or hopefully laughing. The punchline is a reference to the lines of poetry sung for the Prophet upon his safe arrival in Medina, a quick-thinking attempt to subvert the possibility of policing, both by cleverly reminding the militiamen of the presence of song in the Prophet's life, and by appealing to their senses of humor. While his enthusiastic rejoinder could not guarantee Muhammad's safe passage out of the checkpoint encounter, it could and did guarantee a rhetorical and affective shift, which in turn produced a shift in what and whose conception of law was putatively enforced. So let me conclude now by returning to the poster for my talk today. I chose this image of Tripolitana Radio 87.7 FM somewhat hastily, thinking, what is a picture that looks like sound? But I think this image is a useful provocation for thinking, as many scholars are, including a number who I think are here today, about how a focus on sound impacts how we talk about place. This is a picture that I took during fieldwork, not for any clear reason other than for a sense of dutiful recording. For a short time, I visited this building frequently. It was broadcasting, but as far as I remember, that happened primarily through an automated program that didn't receive much human attention. I don't think any of my interlocutors with access to this building often listened to their own station, but they did sometimes turn it on while in the car to check the status of the electricity downtown. If the station was broadcasting music, the power was on and we could expect to find an air-conditioned interior. If there was static, we knew to go elsewhere in search of a respite from the summer heat. A number of corporate and especially radio buildings operated similarly as mixed gender spaces for creative work and socializing. They would sort of emerge and fall away as agreements and conflicts occurred with landlords or militias who framed these activities as permissible or transgressions. Like the beach, these places were sites for the production and contestation of militia power, shifting in what they enabled and constrained as who and what called itself a governing and policing authority changed. So I'll stop there and we have a good amount of time for some discussion. Thank you for listening.
Great, thank you so much, Leila. So provocative. There's just so much there. And so I encourage everyone who would like to ask Leila a question to, well, maybe I should put it on gallery view. Everybody should feel free to either put it in the chat and I will pose it to Leila, or to let me know if I don't see you that you'd like to ask a question, and I'll and you can unmute yourselves. You really present us with a lot of material that so I want to go back to the very beginning of your presentation and ask you, so we know that sound and affect can't be unlinked, right? Sound carries affect. Affect is sonic, whether we hear it or not, in the human range of hearing. But I'm wondering about the musicians that played there in your particular example. And I Want to Get Married, a very kind of traditional, not shocking statement, but I don't want my friends to see her because they're shady. So I'm wondering about the actual relation between the groups that the militia allowed to sing. Is there a relation between them and the power that they represent?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's an interesting question. I think, I mean, in one sense, it's a little bit difficult to know who they might have excluded from playing, because as far as I know, in terms of from my experiences with my musician interlocutors who were playing there, for them there was kind of one main figure who had a relatively close relationship with the beach manager, and so who developed kind of a working relationship with the militia leader, and they were friendly, you could say. And so he was kind of the main figure, and that's whose song and whose voice you heard. And then he would kind of rotate in and out friends of his in the broader community of Tripoli-based musicians. And so the kind of content of the show changed fairly regularly. There were oftentimes a lot of covers played. There's a big community of a certain age of especially men musicians in Tripoli who really, really like 80s American ballads. So there's kind of a certain repertoire that would often be included. And I think, I talked with my musician interlocutors fairly regularly about the kind of question of how they thought about what music they did and didn't play at these shows. And so that singer in particular was very well known during this time, in part because he's also an internet personality, has hosted a number of TV shows and was very active in his social media accounts, especially during that time. And so this was a song that many of the audience members knew already from the internet. and knew that it was poking fun, like knew that he as an individual kind of figure was really not very likely to get married anytime soon, and that he was kind of playing with, I mean, his calling out his friend Brahim at the beginning and saying the song was for him was like a really pointed kind of poking at what he saw as kind of aspects of, especially we could say sort of Libyan male sociality that he thought were deserve to be ridiculed. So I think they would sometimes, among the musicians that did play in this concert series, there was definitely a limit in terms of genre, and then there was a limit in terms of kind of who knew each other. But it was all in all, I think, a fairly welcoming place for new musicians. Oftentimes, it wasn't very uncommon that especially teenagers who didn't have any experience performing might get up early in the evening and play something. So it was welcoming in that respect. But I think it's certainly also the case that, I mean, I think there's some self-selection, the more established kind of and establishment musicians who would play kind of either the genres that were supported under the government before 2011, or who are even people like wedding singers, people who's kind of have kind of an institutional home in terms of their music performance, you wouldn't find in this space. But I think it was a continually kind of negotiated line, what in terms of content, either lyrical or kind of, or affective, I guess, that could be kind of a part of how these performances played out.
Yeah, I guess my question was about aesthetics. You know, what's the relation of aesthetics to the space and to politics, and is there a direct relation or not? And it sounds like there may not be, but I don't want to linger there because I misspoke and I asked people to put things in the chat, but in fact it's in the Q&A, and there are some questions. I guess I'm going to field them. So one of our colleagues asked, as part of your study, did you observe and document the effect of sound and political authority on the literal and artwork of Libyan female artists post-Gaddafi? Sound and political authority on women at this time.
Yeah, thank you for that question, anonymous attendee. I think I'm guessing that maybe the question is about literary and artwork, but I might be, correct me if I'm understanding it wrong. I mean, so let's see. All of my encounters as a researcher doing ethnography in Libya have been deeply shaped by gendered norms and gendered constraints. They have that, so being a woman ethnographer working in Libya during this period, and being a person who has family in Libya, very much shaped both how I was able and continue to be able to make connections with people, and when that is more difficult. So I say that about myself in order to say also that, so on the one hand, I have, we could say sort of privileged access to be able to, it's not very difficult for me to find and connect with women artists, but they do continue to be as a category quite constrained. So they're sort of a minority in my study for, I think, a number of reasons. And in some cases, my experiences, I mean, there was, for example, a period where I was working fairly closely with a female hip hop artist. And that was a really difficult part of my ethnography to figure out how to include in writing or not, in part because to do something like be a hip hop artist who's actively making music when you are a young woman in Libya is also to put yourself into maybe a more marginalized position than this particular person already was by virtue of socioeconomic circumstances, et cetera. And so there are lots of ways in which it's much easier to work with male artists. But I feel like maybe there's an aspect of the question that I didn't answer. Now I don't know where the question went.
Yeah, I think it's been, it's disappeared.
Well, I would say, I mean, yes, the basic answer is yes, right? I did observe and document the effect of sound and political authority on the work of Libyan female artists, and that will absolutely be in the book. There will be women in the book.
Bill Bregan asks, gets to the second part of your talk about racialization, and notes that the hip hop song "I Want to Get Married," a rock song, might read as white. He says, while the hip hop songs might resonate as being black. Within this context, do the choices of genre also reflect ethnic, racial identity and allegiances? You know, do these things map on each other?
Yeah, thank you, Bill, for that question. That's I think a really important question, and I would say actually that the racial politics of genre for musicians who are choosing, you know, a Western genre that has racial association, I would say that the ability to move between these genres reflects, in many cases, actually how the formation of the kind of Libyan formation of whiteness that I'm trying to describe and theorize functions, right? So the ability to kind of unproblematically not think too hard about what genre you want to use. I wouldn't say at all that this reflects a kind of allegiance in the sense of anti-racism, right? Because it's oftentimes, as we see in many contexts around the world, non-Black hip hop artists, sometimes, and in Libya this is no different, will appropriate things like the use of the N-word in ways that are very unselfconscious and not particularly critical in terms of thinking through how that what that means, you know, how their own particular embodiment and positionality affects that usage. So this is a very widespread thing in Libya, that there's a kind of appropriation of Western terms or Western is not the word, right? But racialized ideas and idioms of race that sometimes serve to, I think, that map onto a context of the way that racialization works in Libya in ways that have lots of violences to them.
Can we push you a little bit further on the race thing? Because the name of the town sounds awful like Tuareg. Can you tell me the name of the town in Morocco? Tuarega our people are basically Black, and it goes back to the Tuareg, right? People from sub-Saharan Africa. So can you talk about that? Because the militias were considered, that is, Gaddafi was aligned with the people considered Tuareg because they were inscripted. I was a little confused.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, there's kind of a number of threads that pull into the story of Tuareg, and so at the level of the naming of the town, it doesn't share the same etymology as Tuareg. It's Rain, so Tuareg, and from what I've read, scholars for the most part say that this name is an Amazigh name, and that the town, has had that name for a very long time. And it's certainly not the case that the town was before its destruction, or has always been all Black residents. That's not the case, right? It's certainly more complex than that. But there is this aspect of, so partly the way that Gaddafi, so we're talking about a couple things at once, right? On the one hand, you have the kind of well-known shift where Gaddafi moves from his kind of, mantle of Pan-Arabism to a mantle of Pan-Africanism that happens having to do with particular relations with other Arab leaders, right? And so he sort of, to oversimplify, gives up and moves to a kind of an attempt at Pan-Africanism in which he names himself the King of Kings of Africa, right? And so there's his own project of Pan-Africanism is deeply problematic insofar as there's, lots of reports of him kind of returning home from his trips and then using violent racialized language to describe the other leaders he's met, etc. So part of his idea of his own sort of entitlement of a position of authority in a Pan-African structure that he wants to see has to do with his own anti-Blackness. Yet, at the same time, there are a whole bunch of other complexities, right? So there were projects in which, for example, Tuareg, who did not previously have citizenship in Libya and who, moved between Libya and Chad, Libya and Mali, were able to access, like we were given citizenship in exchange for fighting on the side that Gaddafi was supporting in a war, for example. And so there's kind of, in a broad sense, an association of Gaddafi with projects of hiring mercenaries from other African countries, right? And then also with a kind of an idea that he somehow has like sided with Africans in a way that belies the way that this happens, I think, in many parts of North Africa, where the word African comes to mean Black African, and it specifically denotes a kind of separating of the North African social space from the continent. I hope that begins to get at it. Of course, it's a complicated topic.
I have to unmute myself, sorry. So Lor Asaf says, thank you for this great presentation. Libyan rapper Ibn Thabit was mediatized outside of Libya in 2011 for his song calling the Libyan youth to rise against Gaddafi. I was wondering how your research connects to or detracts from analyzing the Arab Spring's revolutionary songs.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Yeah, that's great. I'm actually really curious what particular song. I sort of wonder, I'm wondering if it might be Hadaf al-Asasi. I'm curious, so maybe we can talk more about that later. I think, so when I started this project, I began fieldwork prior to starting my PhD, so I had material from 2011. And at the time, I thought that what I was going to be doing when I started my PhD was a project that was about music in the 2011 uprising, because it seemed to me, and I think it certainly was the case, that music was a really powerful force in Libya in particular, and obviously that parallels with other contexts, and obviously those objects circulate and affect between each other and between places. But over time, my project changed, in part just because nobody wanted to talk about the songs from 2011 anymore, and that's partly true. What it actually was as it moved to be 2014 and beyond, when I would ask people questions that in 2011 answers were full of enthusiasm and a lot of there was a lot of attachment to particular songs as to oversimplify again, sort of hopeful, right? That by a few years later, the kind of answers I would get when I asked people about these same songs were oftentimes something that was much more like, oh, I hate remembering that song because it makes me remember how attached I was to it and how hopeful I was and how naive I was. And so with that change in the way that my interlocutors were remembering and were feeling this, the ongoing changing situation, it had to be that it was no longer possible, or it no longer made any sense to write a project that was about that moment by itself. And so instead, this has changed in different, so I guess maybe if I can make myself be more succinct, I will say that I think what I'm trying to contribute to discussions of the kind of revolutionary moment of 2011 that appears differently in different places is writing that into a longer durée, right? So just writing that into both, to historicize what was able to create that moment in Libya in particular, and then also what that moment has meant afterward. But I hope in a way that's much more kind of nuanced than just like, oh, it fell apart or it stopped working, right? failed.
Eli Dollarhide praises you and thanks you for the talk. And he says, I'm interested in your framing of statelessness, which comes up often in prehistory and archaeology too. So some archaeologists talk about theater states where hierarchies and control are created and enforced through performance, music, and drama, rather than military control. Right? So do you see the artists in your work subverting ideas of the state, actually embracing statelessness, or instead are they creating a different kind of state, I guess, or?
Yeah, thank you, Eli. That is a rich question that I will chew on some more. Of course, being sort of the heart of the project in some sense, I'm often changing my mind around this area. But I think what I would say is that so partly it depends on what moment I'm talking about, right? So when I'm talking, for example, about the responses to Gaddafi's question, Momentum, these are very much nationalist performances, right? So in instances like these, the artists I'm describing are absolutely not in any way, shape, or form, I think, subverting a kind of normative modern idea of the state. But I do think, of course, that there are instances where artists and my interlocutors who are, having these kind of interactions in daily life with militias that I'm describing are very much looking for something other than what the options seem to be, right? But part of, I think, so I think at the same time, I think my concern around statelessness in the context of Libya is primarily about wanting to push back against the kind of common description in which, especially political scientists tend to argue that Gaddafi destroyed national institutions, and so once 2011 comes around, there's no state left, right? There's nothing there. And so I think part of one of the things I'm trying to show in the entire project is that even where order looks unstable, orders of all sorts impact experiences, right? Patriarchy and misogyny and white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And that I think wanting to try and reinfuse our discussion of how a state carries over with these institutions that are not conventionally thought of as kind of part of how the state works.
That, for me, answers a lot, actually, of my questions, because in a sense, you're asking what happens when things collapse and how power is then reinstantiated in many, many other ways, including through sound and song, right? Even though it seems like some of the structures that we might identify in the past are gone. Is that correct? Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Andy Eisenberg says he's curious about the concept of sound practices, and it's in your work, and how it's how these structure your book. Are they in terms of genre or genres of sound and practice, or in your exploration of placemaking, do you focus on sound practices like soundscapes? Like the soundscapes of militias or the soundscapes of other things? Yeah, thank you, Andy. That's a great question, and it's a difficult question for me, I think, partly because this is one of the things that's still very much in progress, but also partly because I think what I really like about thinking through sound is the way it impels directionality, and so sometimes sometimes a focus on sound, I think, necessitates a focus on escape, right? There's something about the way an environment is produced, what gets contained within it, what gets pushed out of it. But I think because I'm so interested also in these other moments that don't congeal, I think, in a spatial way in exactly the same way. So thinking about something like interaction at a checkpoint, which I think one could describe a checkpoint as having a soundscape to it. That hasn't been my approach,
partly because, so thinking about a checkpoint, for example, or something like, I was, interrupting myself earlier to mention that I'm noticing recently that these same kinds of, the way one has to listen for both instructions, how instructions are given, and then also for kind of information between militia members is so crucial, that this same kind of process happens when people are disappeared or detained. Because so I was listening to an account earlier of someone who was detained and did not know who had detained him, right? So this is very similar to the checkpoint encounter, where it's, okay, someone's wearing fatigues and someone is, and who do they work for? And so he talks about all the ways that he tried to ascertain where he was, who had him, et cetera, as the days progressed. And one of the kind of primary breakthrough was by overhearing phone calls of the guards in which they're describing that they're at the place, and then either giving information about, okay, it's next to such and such mosque, or it's next to such and such other place that he knows well, and then also kind of calculating that this might, that he has to be aware that they could be intentionally letting him hear this and trying to throw him off. So there's just this really, really layered kind of attentive listening that has to happen. And I think I'm interested in exploring kind of the directionality of that, so the kind of way that makes one move, both in terms of the kind of ethnographic moment itself and in terms of theorizing. I hope that begins to get at it.
And how it creates a subject. How these different listening practices create the subject and carry fear and other emotions and affects in them. I think it's so important. So Maya Kasrani also thanks for the talk and wants to pursue further the theme of statelessness. The way you use statelessness, I guess that's one. And then two, I wanted to ask, she says, about your use of popular culture. So what do we know about the circulation and reception of these songs within Libya? How do they move and who is their audience? And then she says, how are you opposing the senatorial experience of popular citified to other cultural forms? I don't know, maybe begin with popular culture.
Sure.
Circulation and reception.
Okay, thank you, Maya, for that question. So there's a big shift that I have to map, right? So during 2011, that there is an emergence of, so lots of people start making songs either at home or in studios that they have access to, right? And so there's a lot of circulation of popular music in particular during 2011 and maybe even into 2012 on YouTube in particular and through hard drives. So when I was in Libya during the late summer of 2011, I was just sort of given USB drives full of media, and those oftentimes included lots and lots of songs, and then they often also included things like cell phone video of battles. There's like a ton of just people were sort of passing these files in these kinds of ways. But of course, you might already know that in the period since 2011. The mediascape of Libya has changed dramatically, and so we have a ton of TV stations in particular now that are for the most part all very, very partisan. They oftentimes are not transparent about funding, but people sort of tend to assume that they know based on how those sort of 24-hour news channels especially cover the war and political process. And so there is, I think, a shift there in terms of kind of popular culture and particularly popular music, I think shifted along with that change. And so some of the artists who, especially in 2011, I was following for making, kind of very clear sort of with the revolution songs, went on to continue to be very, very clear in their and their partisanship in the ongoing conflict, right? So they would then, their songs would then circulate, for example, on particular news channels, which, you know, they would just sort of stop the news sometimes and play a pop song that, you know, very specifically praised certain actors, etc. I hope that begins to get at your question.
Yeah, and Maya, I either misread or her, she notes that it was not senatorial, but rather sensorial, you know, that sensorial, and now it just disappeared too. I was going to refer to it, but it's disappeared anyway. I misspoke there. You know, maybe we're at the end, but there's one more question. Oh yeah, so I'm sorry, it is here. I meant sensorial. It's interesting because this suggests another form of political identification related for your paradigm of statelessness. The relationship between the rise of popular culture and national imaginaries in the Arab world. So, but I want to get to the last question, which is also really interesting, anonymous. And it's about censorship and, you know, how much of this music was banned, censored, threatened. I think you touched a little bit about the danger in the television stations and such, but maybe you want to answer the censorship question.
Sure, yeah, so let me try and be really brief, but I do want to say just really quick to Maya that I'd love to talk more about this. I think there's really interesting, the kind of thinking about stateless, whether in a kind of a supranational context, so thinking about the experiments, you know, in the 20th century of trying to, you know, create states that sort of merged a couple of Arab states under the banner of Arab nationalism, et cetera. I think, so that's helping, thank you for that. That's making me think in another direction about statelessness. And so in terms of censorship, of course, a major part of what the artists that I work with in particular deal with is are restrictions, banning, and threats. But the problem is that because there's not a clear central state, this happens oftentimes from a number of directions, right? So part of that kind of so that's a big part of, I think, of what I'm trying to look at it. When a musician, for example, is arrested, I'm thinking of a case of a qanun player who was accused of being like Muslim Brotherhood by a militia who was ostensibly fighting terrorism, and held for some period. So how that person, how they kind of get narrated, but then also who's able to get them out. There's kind of, this is a lot of the ongoing kinds of contestation I'm looking at.
And, you know, to go back to the theme of sensorial, I mean, you're talking in a sense about sensorial regimes and how they contest each other and are vying for power, but not in a official sense, but rather in many ways, sound-wise and otherwise. So, are there any questions I did not ask? I think we might have covered it. We're out of time. You've given us so much to think about, Leila, and you know the wonderful thing is that you're here for a while, and we can connect with you and have chances to discuss this fascinating and really rich material with you going forward. So thank you so much for presenting it to us. Thank you everybody for attending, and we will, Leila, you and I will talk soon, and good night to everybody.